She once believed that love, even when imperfect and strained, still carried a sense of responsibility, that when two people chose to build a family, especially when a child arrived, walking away was no longer an option. And maybe that belief made her vulnerable. Maybe it made her easy to disappoint, but it also meant she trusted deeply, completely, without preparing herself for the possibility that the person she depended on most could one day decide that staying was no longer convenient. When she married him, their life was modest but hopeful: a small apartment, secondhand furniture, evenings filled with tired laughter and conversations about what they would one day provide for their children. And when she became pregnant, he seemed proud, protective, even gentle in a way she hadn't seen before, resting his hand on her stomach as if he was already promising to be present for whatever came next. But after the baby was born, the warmth in him slowly began to fade, not in ways that were obvious at first, but in silences that lasted longer, in irritation that replaced patience, in a growing distance that he blamed on exhaustion and financial pressure. And she accepted those explanations because she wanted to believe that difficult seasons were normal, that love was proven by endurance, that things would improve once they found their rhythm as parents. What she did not know was that he had already begun planning a life without her. The night he drove them to the shelter, he spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded temporary and reasonable, telling her they just needed somewhere to stay for a little while, that he would fix things and come back for them soon. And she believed him because believing was easier than admitting that something was terribly wrong, and because she was too emotionally drained, too overwhelmed by caring for a newborn, to question the way he avoided her eyes as he handed their bags to the woman at the front desk. He did not return the next day, or the day after that. And when she finally managed to reach him, his voice was colder than she had ever heard it, distant, impatient, as if her fear and confusion were inconveniences he did not have time to deal with. And he told her that he needed to think about his own future, that he was not ready for this level of responsibility, that she should focus on getting help from social services. And when she reminded him that the child belonged to both of them, he paused before saying the words that would stay with her long after the call ended. He had not signed up for this life, as if she had, as if abandonment were part of any plan a woman makes when she imagines motherhood and marriage. Soon after, legal papers followed, delivered without conversation, without explanation, reducing everything they had shared into a list of obligations he was trying to minimize. And she realized that in his mind, she was no longer a partner, no longer a person he felt responsible for, but a problem he wanted removed from his path. What made the pain deeper was how easily the world adjusted to this reality. No one questioned his disappearance. No one demanded that he face what he had done. Instead, the focus turned entirely to her, to what programs she qualified for, what resources she could access, how she would manage on her own, as if his absence were unfortunate but expected, as if responsibility were something that could quietly dissolve once it became inconvenient. She learned to survive in ways she never imagined she would, learning how to stretch donations, how to sleep lightly with her baby in unfamiliar rooms, how to accept help without breaking down, how to hide her fear behind polite smiles. What she could not know in those early days of humiliation and uncertainty was that her life story did not begin with that shelter. That long before she was born, decisions had been made that connected her to a world of wealth and influence so distant from her current reality that it felt almost cruel in its contrast. She did not know that her mother had once walked away from a powerful family to protect her child. She did not know that the grandfather she had never met had spent years trying to find her. And she certainly did not know that the man who believed he had erased her by leaving her at a shelter had unknowingly abandoned the granddaughter of a billionaire. And that one day he would understand exactly what he had thrown away. Weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, sleepless nights, and quiet routines that revolved entirely around keeping the baby fed, warm, and safe. And during that time, she stopped thinking about the future in any meaningful way because the present demanded all of her energy, all of her focus, and all of her emotional restraint just to make it through each day without falling apart. The shelter was not cruel, but it was not kind either. It was functional. Beds, schedules, rules, and waiting lists. People came and went, some with stories heavier than hers, others who spoke with bitterness about systems that failed them, and she listened more than she talked, learning quickly that hope was something you had to protect carefully because too much of it could be dangerous when reality refused to cooperate. One afternoon, a volunteer sat beside her while she was rocking the baby, making casual conversation the way people do when they want to distract themselves from the heaviness of a place like that, and asked her about her family, about whether there was anyone who could help her. And she shook her head without much thought, explaining that her mother had passed away years ago, that she never knew her father, that there was no one left to call. The volunteer paused, studying her face for a moment longer than felt comfortable, before saying something that would later become impossible to forget. "You look like someone I've seen before," she said gently. "Not personally, in photographs." At the time, it sounded ridiculous, almost laughable, and she dismissed it with an awkward smile, assuming the woman was simply trying to make conversation. But the volunteer did not seem convinced, and over the next few days she asked more questions, careful ones about her last name, about where she had grown up, about whether her mother had ever mentioned extended family. Most of the answers led nowhere. Her mother had been private, protective, unwilling to speak about the past, and as a child she had accepted that silence as normal. Only now, in retrospect, did that silence begin to feel intentional. A few days later, a man arrived at the shelter asking to speak with her. Not a social worker, not a lawyer, but someone who introduced himself as an investigator hired by a private foundation, claiming they were searching for a woman whose details matched parts of her background. And though his words were polite and careful, the implication felt unreal, almost absurd, and she nearly refused to speak with him at all, convinced that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding, or worse, a scam. But curiosity and a quiet sense of unease she couldn't explain led her to listen. He spoke about records from decades ago, about a young woman who had disappeared after leaving a powerful family, about attempts to locate her daughter that had failed repeatedly, about a man who had never stopped searching, despite being told that the child might not want to be found. And as he spoke, details began to line up in ways that made her chest tighten. Her mother's age, the city they had lived in when she was born, the last name her mother had once mentioned, but never explained. The investigator did not say the word billionaire. He did not need to. The names he mentioned were enough. She had heard them before, in business news, in charity galas broadcast on television, in conversations about people who controlled industries she could barely pronounce. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was fear. Because if this were true, it meant that everything her mother had been hidden for a reason. And that reason was not something she could ignore just because her life had already been complicated enough. The investigator left it contact information and told her to think about it, to decide whether she wanted to pursue this further, emphasizing that nothing would happen without her consent, that no one would force their way into her life, and she appreciated that, because the idea of powerful strangers suddenly claiming a connection to her felt more threatening than comforting. That night she barely slept, holding her baby, listening to the quiet breathing that reminded her why she had to be careful with every decision she made. She thought about her mother, about the stories she had told, about the ones she had carefully avoided, about how fiercely she had protected her from anyone who might try to take her away. And slowly, a painful possibility took shape. Her mother had not been running from poverty, she had been running from power. The next day, she agreed to meet the investigator again, this time at a neutral location, and brought the few documents she had left from her mother, old photographs, a birth certificate, a faded letter she had never fully understood. And as he reviewed them, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to something closer to certainty. He told her that DNA confirmation would be necessary, that nothing could be officially acknowledged without it, but that the likelihood of coincidence was extremely small. What she did not realize, sitting there in borrowed clothes with circles under her eyes and exhaustion weighing down every word, was that while she was learning about a past she had never known, someone else was about to learn that the woman he had discarded was not as powerless as he believed. Because investigations, even discreet ones, leave traces. And in certain circles, news travels fast, much faster than guilt. The DNA results did not arrive with celebration or relief, but with a quiet gravity that settled into the room like an unspoken truth everyone had already accepted. And when the investigator finally confirmed what had long been suspected, that she was indeed the missing granddaughter of one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, she did not cry, did not smile, did not react the way people might expect when discovering a fortune hidden in their bloodline, because wealth was not what she had lost, and it was not what she needed most in that moment. What she felt was grief, grief for her mother, who had carried the secret alone for years, who had chosen safety and obscurity over comfort and privilege, who had sacrificed everything to keep her child away from a world she believed would hurt her. And now, standing at the edge of that very world, she finally understood the weight of the choices her mother had made. The grandfather did not rush into her life with grand gestures. There were no cameras, no dramatic embraces, no sudden luxury. There were meetings with lawyers, private conversations with doctors, long discussions about privacy, protection, and boundaries. And when he finally met her in person, he did not speak about money. He spoke about regret, about searching, about never stopping, even when everyone told him to let go. He apologized for not finding her sooner, and for the first time since her baby was born, she allowed herself to cry, not because her problems were suddenly solved, but because someone was finally acknowledging that what she had been through mattered. Arrangements were made carefully: a secure apartment, medical care for the baby, legal protection, and with every step forward, she insisted on one thing. She would not disappear into his world. She would not become a headline. She would not allow her life to be turned into a public spectacle. Her grandfather respected that. But while she was being quietly protected, her husband's life was beginning to unravel in ways he could not understand. At first it was small things, a loan that was suddenly denied, a business partner who backed out of a deal without explanation, friends who became distant, cautious, less willing to include him in opportunities they once would have offered freely. He blamed bad luck, bad timing, unfair competition. What he did not know was that in powerful networks, information does not need to be spoken openly to be understood. People had begun asking questions about his character, about his recent separation, about why his wife and newborn had ended up in a shelter. And those questions did not stay quiet for long. When he finally learned the truth, it did not come from her. It came from someone who assumed he already knew, someone who mentioned her name in a conversation about family connections, about old scandals, about a billionaire who had finally found his lost granddaughter. At first he laughed. He thought it had to be a coincidence. But when he saw the photographs, when he recognized her face in images he was never supposed to see, standing beside a man whose wealth and influence were impossible to deny, the laughter disappeared. Panic took its place. He tried to contact her immediately. Calls, messages, apologies that arrived too late and sounded more like desperation than remorse. But she did not answer, not because she wanted revenge, but because she finally understood something that had taken her a long time to learn. Someone who abandons you at your weakest does not deserve access to you when you become strong. Legal proceedings followed, not dramatic lawsuits, not public accusations, just quiet, efficient corrections to decisions he had made when he believed she had no power to challenge him. Child support arrangements that could not be negotiated away. Property issues that were suddenly reopened. Contracts that were reviewed by people far more experienced than his own lawyers. And for the first time since he had walked away so easily, he was forced to face the reality that actions do not disappear just because you leave the room. They wait, and eventually they collect interest. He tried once more to reach her through intermediaries, suggesting meetings, conversations, chances to explain himself, but she declined every request, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding her life with stability, privacy, and dignity, refusing to let him re-enter her world simply because he now realized what he had lost. And while he struggled with consequences he never expected to face, she was finally learning what it felt like to live without constant fear, without calculating every expense, without wondering whether she would be able to protect her child on her own. But the story was not finished yet, because consequences are not always financial. Sometimes they are social, sometimes they are emotional, and sometimes they arrive in moments you cannot escape. Moments where you are forced to confront the person you chose to become. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom or across a table filled with lawyers, but in a quiet public space where neither of them had planned to meet. A charity event connected to one of her grandfather's foundations, where she was present not as a guest of honor, not as a symbol of reconciliation, but simply as a woman supporting a cause she now cared deeply about. He recognized her instantly, not because she looked wealthier, but because she looked different in a way that had nothing to do with clothes or surroundings. Standing straight, calm, unafraid. no longer carrying the uncertainty that had once made her easy to dismiss. And he hesitated before approaching, as if unsure whether he still had the right to speak to her at all. When he finally did, his voice was unsteady. He said her name. She turned, already knowing who it would be, already prepared for this moment in a way she had never been prepared for anything in her life before. He tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to rewrite the story into something that sounded less cruel, less calculated, less final, saying he had been overwhelmed, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he never imagined things would turn out like this, that if he had known who she was, he would never have. And that was when she stopped him, not with anger, not with raised voice, but with a quiet certainty that left no room for negotiation. "If you needed my last name to know I deserved respect," she said, "then you were never capable of being the husband or father we needed." He had no answer for that, because there was no version of reality where abandoning a woman and her newborn at a shelter could be justified by ignorance of her family connections. The truth was simple and impossible to escape. He had not left because he was afraid. He had left because he thought he could. He asked if he could see the baby. She told him that if he wanted to be part of the child's life, he would have to prove consistency, responsibility, and effort over time, not through dramatic apologies, not through guilt, but through actions. Because forgiveness, when children are involved, is not about emotions. It is about safety. He nodded, but she could already see the disappointment in his eyes, the realization that there would be no instant redemption, no emotional shortcut back into her life. What he did not understand yet was that she was not punishing him. She was protecting her peace and her child's. In the months that followed, she settled into a new rhythm, one that was no longer shaped by survival, but by choice, choosing how much of her past she shared, choosing which relationships she invested in, choosing what kind of future she wanted to build, not as someone defined by betrayal, but as someone defined by resilience. Her grandfather did not try to control her life. He supported. He listened. He respected the independence her mother had raised her with, understanding that protection does not mean possession, and that love, when it is real, does not demand obedience in exchange for security. She began working in areas she had once only dreamed of, using resources not to escape reality, but to improve it, helping other women who found themselves abandoned, unsupported, and invisible. Not because she wanted to be a symbol, but because she remembered exactly what it felt like to hold a baby in a room that did not feel safe and wonder if anyone in the world cared. Sometimes she still thought about the version of herself who had stood in that shelter, terrified and confused, and she wished she could go back and whisper something into that woman's ear, something simple and powerful and true. This is not the end of your story. This is the beginning of your strength. As for him, his life did not collapse into tragedy, but it never returned to the careless comfort he once enjoyed, because certain reputations do not fully recover. Certain doors remain closed, and certain choices follow you quietly into every new beginning, reminding you of who you were when it mattered most. He lost the privilege of being trusted. She gained the freedom of no longer needing him. And in that balance, justice found its place, not through punishment, but through consequence. She did not celebrate what he lost. She focused on what she had found: stability, clarity, and a future that belonged entirely to her and her child. And if anyone ever asks how she survived being abandoned when she was most vulnerable, she does not talk about wealth or power or family connections. She talks about strengths she did not know she had, about refusing to disappear, about choosing to keep going even when the world turned its back. Because in the end, what saved her was not who she was related to. It was who she chose to become.